Friday night with Byline Times. I'm Peter Jukes.
And I'm Hardeep Matharu, and over the next hour we'll bring you what the papers don't say.
And what the TV doesn't tell you. Now, coming up, we'll be discussing whether the England squad would make better political leaders than the current government. And we'll be talking to Adrian Goldberg, not only our podcast producer, but a deep football aficionado who's been following England back to the dark days of the 80s.
And is Priti Patel's new plan for immigration attempting to create an even more hostile environment for those seeking asylum in Britain? We've got a special report with the charity Refugee Action.
And also, later on, we'll be joined by our special investigations reporter, Nafeez Ahmed, who for over a year has been investigating the government's coronavirus response. Last week, he had a scoop about this modelling, about getting children infected to achieve once again that chimera of herd immunity. We'll find out more from him. But meanwhile, we rely on you. We do not have a hedge fund in Dubai like a certain GB News. We don't have a Murdoch somewhere in America with vast amounts of money. All we have is you. So we rely on your support to keep broadcasting and making these programs. And if you can, support us either by going to YouTube and becoming a member, and you can even join this super chat function and talk to us after the show in our special After Dark section. Or you can do the same again on Patreon, become a member, and we have a special Q&A for you coming up after the show.
Now let's have a look at our front page for Byline Times today, Peter. And of course it leads with
New England. Yeah. Who knew we'd write about football? I mean,
it's not something, Byline Times isn't known for its sports coverage. We don't do huge amounts of it, but primarily because we're what the papers don't say, and there's plenty of it being done really well elsewhere. But when we do sport, when it's a cultural moment like this, which is really rare, what does the England team say about Englishness and identity and where we are as a country?
Well, we've been writing about Englishness, I've written about it, you have, Britishness and all these things, but we're not really experts. Let's go to the expert now. Let's go to Adrian Goldberg to show how English he is. He's deep in the Herefordshire countryside, where apparently a cat is currently eating a vole. Welcome, Adrian.
I think he's made pretty short work of the vole, actually. The vole's long gone. All that's left of it is the tail, I'm afraid, but there we go.
I hope that's no prediction for the match on Sunday. But let's just talk about you and football, Adrian, because you've been following the team, I think the English national team, apart from all your club support, you write brilliantly about football, way back in the dark days of the 80s, and that's when I remember losing faith in football. It was so violent. Tell us about how England has changed. Has it changed? Have the supporters changed? Are we generally seeing, as some people say, a new England, something which is not ethnically based, which isn't that sort of nobody likes us and we don't care?
Well, it's true that the England team has been multicultural, has been diverse for decades, really, going back to the early 1980s when Viv Anderson of Nottingham Forest became the first black player to make his debut for England. But that was never reflected in the stands or on the terraces. And I ought to explain that I'm someone of migrant stock myself. My father was a German Jewish refugee. My mother was an economic migrant from Ireland. But both of them were keen that I should assimilate and be as English as possible. Now, I had a natural affinity for football, but it seemed to me as well as a young man and as a teenager that a ready passport to Englishness was to follow the English team. I had all sorts of neighbours in the council flats where I grew up with people who came from different parts of the world. But if you grew up loving football, in Birmingham, as I did, pretty much everybody supported England, whatever their background. That was only tested when I first travelled away to watch England in 1988 for the Euro 88 tournament. So this was the 1988 equivalent of the tournament that England are now in the final of. And I was truly shocked by the level of bigotry, the level of overt racism, the level of whiteness amongst the English support, because as a follower of West Bromwich Albion, we'd had 3 black players coming through in the late 1970s. There was certainly wasn't a properly, if you like, diverse group of supporters at West Brom, but overt racism was definitely frowned upon, perhaps unlike some other stadiums. So to go away to follow England really was a very rude awakening. And it was the first time that I really started to question my Englishness, because I got the real sense from these people that I perhaps was not English enough for them, even though I was born in the country, because I had parents who came from elsewhere. And I certainly got the very clear impression that people of colour were not regarded by many of those England fans at the time as capable of Englishness. And sadly, that attitude, I think, even though it has diluted and it's died down somewhat in the years since, that is still present there, I'm afraid, amongst some England supporters.
Is that why they're booing at taking the knee? That's that element of the national support?
I think that's part of, I definitely think that's part of it, isn't it? I mean, there's this whole notion on the right that somehow if you're taking the knee, that you're supporting a Marxist organization, even though many people have made efforts to explain that it's not, you're not supporting a Marxist organization. This is about a movement towards equality. And I've been so impressed by England's manager, Gareth Southgate, who made it clear in the face of hostility, not only from some of his own supporters, but also the Home Secretary Priti Patel, who said that taking the knee was gesture politics. Gareth Southgate very calmly, very firmly just said, well, we believe in it. Our players want to do this. We're showing solidarity and we will continue to do it. That was, for me, was a different kind of Englishness than the kind that we see emanating from Downing Street and some of the cabinet members.
I mean, there's an amazing essay now, Hardeep, Dear England, which I think we're all touched by. I noticed that certain Tory MPs suspected Gareth Southgate hadn't written it, but it sounded very much in his voice. And I'm wondering if that's the real shift here. I mean, as she's talking, he's writing for us, like your front page piece, Adrian, a French journalist, Philippe Auclair, who's an expert on football. And he made this point that in 1998, they had this very diverse team in France that won the World Cup. But the optics were great, but nothing happened. And he said the crucial difference is with the English team is how engaged they are, not just taking the knees, Marcus Rashford, on poverty and school meals, they're donating their money, any winnings to charity. Is there an ethos in the team which explains that actually, whether you call it woke or not, the English quite like this other side, this decency, this socially responsible and team building side, which Southgate has created?
Yeah, well, I think Southgate is different to previous England managers in that he totally buys into it. So he understands the significance of taking the knee. Of the squad of 26, there are 10 players of colour in that team. He understands what taking the knee means to them and the structural racism that they will have had to overcome before achieving perhaps salaries of £180,000 a week. But as you say, many of the players are more socially conscious, I think, than previous generations. Marcus Rashford forced a U-turn on school meals. Boris Johnson phoned him up to tell him that he was changing his policy on free school meals. And Raheem Sterling as well is a player who has witnessed firsthand the racism of the newspapers after England were turfed out of the last European Championships in 2016, having lost to Iceland. There was a really appalling article in the Daily Mail which mocked Sterling for buying a house for his mum. And it accused him of vulgarity, referenced the word bling and so on. And by contrast, another England player now, Phil Foden, had bought a house for his mum. And that had been regarded as a good thing, as of course it is, but there was none of that horrible snobbery and sneering and underlying racism that there had been in the Sterling story. And unlike previous generations, Sterling took to social media and took on the papers head on. He'd also been targeted by The Sun, who pointed out that he had a tattoo of a gun on his leg. His father was shot dead when he was aged just 2, Raheem Sterling, in Jamaica, where he was born. So both Rashford and Sterling have been willing to take on the press. And Sterling, very pointedly, after suffering racial abuse at a game away at Chelsea for his club side, Manchester City, pointed out that he believed that the racism in the crowd was, if not originating in the press, was certainly being fostered and encouraged by the press. So I think we have a new mood amongst the players, and we have a manager in Southgate who understands the psyche of his players. Cometh the hour, cometh the man. He's not only the right football manager for England at this moment, he's the right man to lead England at the moment. He gets it.
And Adrian, what do you think this says about nationalism in the UK and in England? I mean, we've had Boris Johnson and Priti Patel saying they don't necessarily support the taking of the knee, it's gesture politics, and yet when we stormed through to the final on Wednesday night, I mean, there were all these photos being released on social media of them celebrating in football shirts. I mean, people are worried that there's going to be a co-option here, that if actually we go on to even greater success on Sunday, Boris Johnson and his government are going to claim victory for themselves. You know, it's all because of Brexit, it's all because of how exceptional we are. I mean, is there a way that this fantastic team and ethos that Gareth Southgate and his men have created can carry on beyond the Euros? Or do you think it's just going to be used to feed more of this nationalism and populism, more of these culture wars?
Yeah, well, I think Boris Johnson is not credible as a football fan to football supporters, even to right-leaning football supporters. When he was pictured in the stadium the other day, he had his England shirt on over his normal shirt. I mean, no football fan does that. Absolutely ludicrous. So I think there will be an attempt by Boris Johnson and Priti Patel to try and claim a kind of English success out of this. But I think the demeanour of the players, and I think this was picked up in the ITV commentary after the game by Gary Neville, I don't think the players are part of that, and I don't think they really suit that narrative. And Gary Neville talked, didn't he, about how Gareth Southgate had shown a leadership that had been absent from our politicians in the last 2 years. And I think as somebody who's kind of grown up in an era when footballers were very quiet about their political affiliations, but when their favourite groups were the Stylistics, when their favourite meal was steak and chips, you knew they were Tory voters in the main. And although this group of players are young men with massive earnings, and you know, some people are offended by the scale of the earnings, other people will say, well, look, you know, they are the people who generate the wealth in the game. I think there is a social consciousness about this team, or at least some of its key players, which militates against that. I don't think they'll be taken for fools or played for fools by the likes of Boris Johnson or Priti Patel. I think Southgate and his key players are intelligent enough to see through that.
So I remember the last time things shifted, it was only, we didn't get through, but it was Italia 1990 and the famous BBC song, which then became a hit globally, Nessun Dorma, and Gazza's Tears, and suddenly football from the dark days of the 80s, where it was seen as sort of, you know, after Hillsborough and Heysel, as a kind of a dangerous sport just for the working class, became very middle class. But then what seemed to happen in the 90s and noughties, wasn't it, that it became, they extensively got hacked by the tabloids we now know, but it became very much the wags and the celebrity culture. And individuals, and we'd all fuss whether somebody had an injury or not, or best on form. You as a football expert, are we seeing something different here? I hear it's true of the Italian team too. There aren't great individuals, but the team spirit, if you're going to look at something culturally about football, is just as important as any brilliant individuals. And is it right that sort of Southgate has built this strength and depth, the sense there's no one individual who can make it or ruin it for the whole team?
I think that's absolutely right. I think, I'm trying to think of the game now, perhaps it was the Ukraine 4-0 victory when immediately after the game, Gareth Southgate, his first action after the final whistle was to hug the non-playing substitutes. Any top team is going to have 2 or 3 perhaps star players who can really turn a game. But Southgate has worked really hard to foster the ethos of a team, which must be incredibly difficult. I mean, essentially, you're encouraging a bunch of millionaires who know that a goal perhaps might earn them a several £1 million sponsorship deal. You're trying to mould those bunch of individuals into a team. I think Southgate has done that tremendously and managed to generate a kind of club ethos around the England team, and that is not easy. And all those temptations are there. And as you say, there are always going to be tabloids kind of peering in, trying to fester dissent, looking for stories. Of course, there was the famous one before Italia 90 when a few of the players had been out on a drinking spree in Hong Kong. Paul Gascoigne famously had a bottle of spirits poured down his neck in what was called the dentist's chair in a Hong Kong bar. That was front page news, and Gascoigne was absolutely slaughtered and pilloried by the tabloids. We know that Gascoigne had his phone hacked. We know that David Beckham had his phone hacked as well. Greg Miskiw, a former News of the World executive, has said that in recent years. So the players were themselves offering, if you like, to be celebrities. They were also taken advantage of, exploited, built up by the tabloids, and then viciously hacked down. I think ironically now, because players are so wealthy and because there is social media, they actually are less in need of the tabloids.
Yes,
and there is a degree of independence now. Players don't have to worry about offending the tabloids because they can get their message out on Instagram, on TikTok, on Twitter, or wherever.
Marcus Rashford has 4 million followers or something. You know, I think that's right, isn't it? And
almost as many as me.
Yeah, you know, and doesn't tweet as prolifically as you do. So I'm very superstitious about this thing. I'm not going to ask for a prediction at all. Though it's obviously a close match and we're maybe not the favourites but with a home advantage. But do you think, win or lose, that somehow, because of this ethos, that there's a different kind of England? England hasn't got a parliament. It's often represented in quite a racist and exclusive way. That there's a different kind of England that has already won.
Absolutely. And I think it shows that there is an Englishness that can be not threatening to outsiders, not bigoted, not hateful, but an Englishness that is inclusive, that is warm, that is tolerant, and that is welcoming. That's demonstrated by the players and by the manager. I still have to say, inside the stadium, it's not always represented by the team. I go back to Italia 90, when the Mexican wave had first started to take hold. And I was in all of those stadiums, saw every one of England's games in Italia 90. And you were under real pressure as a fan not to take part in the Mexican wave. And there was this kind of exceptionalism amongst the English crowd. We will not take part in what Johnny Foreigner does in the stadium. We're not going to have good fun whilst we're on holiday in the sunshine in the summer watching football. We're not going to enjoy ourselves. The strain of that is still there with the same England fans who booed the taking of the knee, and with the England fans now who boo the opposition anthem. But I think Southgate and his players have shown that there is a different kind of Englishness, and that's an Englishness that I want to be part of and that I feel included by. I don't feel part of Boris Johnson or Priti Patel's Englishness, or the Englishness of those hateful bigots who boo the opposition anthem.
Oh, wow. That's beautifully put, Adrian. And thank you very much for coming and sharing your thoughts. And fingers crossed for Sunday, I guess.
For glory, triumph,
I'm drinking to them. I'm drinking to them.
Enjoy your drink. And if anybody wants to read Adrian's thoughts in more detail, he's on the front page of Byline Times. I'm sure he'll be on there again next week when the result comes through. We'll talk to you next week, Adrian.
Thank you. Wow, a lot of the politicians jumped on the bandwagon, as we were saying to Adrian, Peter.
Well, that one of Boris Johnson with, yes, indeed, with a football shirt.
I think you could see his tie could be seen as well. I
think
some people pointed that out. You could see the outline of his tie, so he had just put it on over his suit.
And he somehow thought the match was being played early in the day, and it wasn't. And of course, Priti Patel, who we're going to talk about again in a moment, and her new asylum bill, an immigration bill. There she is, sort of roaring for joy here at a team that took the knee, when she actually said that was what she called it, a gesture.
She said, asked about it, she said, I don't support it. It's a form of gesture politics. When she was asked whether she would support fans who wanted to boo the England team who were doing that, she said, well, frankly, that's a matter for them. No, so it's quite a U-turn, really.
Yeah, she had the opportunity to criticise them, not support them, and she said, well, it's up to them. So she criticised people for making an anti-racist gesture, or, you know. But what they talk about gesture politics, what is that? What are all these politicians? The picture of them wearing a shirt going, come on, England, come on, it's coming out.
I think all of Downing Street tonight has been covered in St George's flags as well.
So is that not gesture politics?
Interesting. Well, there is. I do think really that what we're going to hear, unfortunately, whether we win or not, we've done so well, the England team, to get this far. And I do think that Boris Johnson is going to wrap it all up into, well, this is great. Now we're opening up society again. We've just won, and it shows how exceptional we are. It's all because of Brexit and, you know, all of these things. But as Adrian said, maybe people will be able to see through that.
I think with people like Southgate, they will. And also, the football isn't going to solve other things, which we're going to find out more, especially when the fees comes on.
Yes, so the Priti Patel's new plan for immigration apparently attempts to crack down on people smugglers and modern slavery, but there are increasing concerns that actually it's going to refuse to provide support to people who genuinely need asylum in this country. For the first time, this new legislation, if it's passed, would criminalise anybody who assists somebody coming to this country for refuge, even if there's no financial gain involved. Well, what do people who did seek refuge in the UK and became part of its communities make of this? Byline TV went to find out with the charity Refugee Action.
My name is Russell. I'm coming from Democratic Republic of Congo in Africa. I've been able to volunteering to support others people and put my skills in the community. No, I think there is no chance if they put this, there is no chance for me to be here, you know, because it's so tight, it's too tight for people. This law, they are thinking to bring it here in the UK. So I think I will not even be here and claiming asylum. Now is not easy, but again, too hard. That will not help people.
But I think it's fair to say that the bill that's come out this week is the kind of culmination of that, a very, very negative, demonising approach to people in the asylum system. And you know, this is an anti-refugee bill. We're seeing the Home Office experimenting with different ways of making things more difficult. That's in terms of the kind of accommodation that people are put in during the asylum process. It's also in terms of how people are treated on the basis of how they arrive in the country. It's focused on making things more difficult for people. It criminalises people. This anti-refugee bill that's being proposed this week just does not take into account the human stories. It's all about acting tough, getting those tough headlines to show that they're dealing with it, but it won't answer any of the problems that they themselves are saying are wrong with the asylum system.
Priti Patel should put more energy on finding why people are coming here. We think that the system should be more fair, more human, so that people can feel safe when they are looking for safety. We all are human, and at the end of the day, we need peace and love between people.
They've probably decided that asylum seekers are a soft target to be able to feed into the culture wars. People are going to be jailed and imprisoned potentially for wanting to seek safety and protection, and this is against the international law, it's against the Refugee Convention. It's illegal and it's impractical and it won't work.
And welcome back, and great to be joined on the sofa by Nafeez Ahmed, our special investigations reporter. And before we go to talk about some of those investigations, particularly in the last 2 weeks, about the government's unlocking plan and their plans for immunity, can we just talk about immigration a bit? Because looking at that story of the asylum seeker, I wouldn't be here. My grandfather fled the Armenian genocide. And though I've struggled with it, I thought of myself as a Welsh Londoner, but now I accept I'm actually culturally English. Without being, where do you come from about it? Hardeep's talked about, maybe you talk about your past in a moment, because you have done, but Nafeez, you know, would you have been let in under Priti, would your parents, or would you be here if Priti Patel had her way? Because I wouldn't.
Difficult to say. I mean, in this particular, my parents weren't asylum seekers,
Yeah,
but they came from Bangladesh, and they came to this country, looking to make a contribution. And Bangladesh is, was part. Bangladesh was created as a result of the impact of colonization. And that's something that's often missing from all of this discussion, is that people coming in and they want to take our jobs and they take everything, and forgotten from that story is what the British Empire did and how it created the conditions, which, in essence, kind of the opening the door was a recognition of, for example, the millions of lives that were lost by people on the subcontinent in fighting the Nazis, for example,
and the war before, And the First World
yeah, absolutely, and the First World War as well. And that's often forgotten. So there was this. I mean, it's, in a way, we moved from a position of this extreme kind of nationalism into a kind of recognition that a kind of more cosmopolitan approach begins to make sense. And I have friends who I have English friends who have parents who worked in the British Army, who were senior officers, who have spoken to me about. We've had these discussions about this kind of stuff, and they've spoken to me about the kind of the change in recognition at the time that the empire had to give, had to change, because they recognised that there was this, there was damage that was done, but they were, they felt that there were some good things that were done, but ultimately they recognised there was almost kind of an unstated contract that Britain has gone to so many parts of the world and changed so many people's lives, and in many cases that was often for the worse, and they also took back so much. I think people often don't realise that civilizational element, that Western civilization actually was, in Britain in particular, was particularly saved as a result of the fact that we could rely on all these colonies to come on board and fight these wars for Britain, was something which is completely forgotten. And I think that's when you bring that into context, then of course there has to be a complete shift in attitude.
But before I talk to Hardeep about this, the other element also was economic necessity, wasn't it? I don't know about your parents. As I said, I'm probably the only asylum seeker descendant here, but people were invited here because they were needed as doctors or as train drivers. The economy, particularly in the mills of Manchester, wasn't it? The country was crying out for labour. So there was, it wasn't just moral obligation, it was economic necessity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when my parents came, they had basically, I've heard the stories that they've told me are stories of struggle, of trying to find their place, but always of working super hard. I've never heard, and coming from a country that had all sorts of experience of poverty and devastation, and then coming here, it wasn't a story of coming and stealing other people's jobs. It was very much about making yourself, and in that process, creating opportunity, forging businesses, contributing to the society around them. And that's a story we often don't hear, that the Britain that we've inherited is one that was created together by these incoming people with people who are already here, and it created something new and something interesting and exciting, and we all benefited from that. We all kind of gained so much from that ability to speak to each other and talk to each other and learn from each other.
Look at the cuisine,
yeah, absolutely.
English cuisine. But Hardeep, it's a similar story for you, isn't it? And also this impetus to work, isn't there? That you trained as a lawyer, your sister trained as a lawyer, doctors. One of the amazing things was, saddest thing to see about the first wave of medics dying in the coronavirus, just how much our health service relies on people from second, third generation families, from imperial families, providing the highest levels of staffing and expertise in the NHS.
Absolutely. And I think what Nafeez is just saying, it's really interesting that the sort of immigrants that came from Commonwealth countries, former colonies, there's a different relationship that exists between, if you like, the British state as it presently is with those communities and other immigrants. And I think this is a point that's really missed, the stratification which was at the heart of empire, creating categories and divide and rule and different loyalties in different places. That has modern consequences. That is still playing out. So I think the modern version of that now, and I mean in recent years, is first we had Brexit, which was looking at European immigration and this notion that actually these migrants, we don't have as much connection with them, and that has to affect how they can come here and contribute and create a new United Kingdom going forward. And then I think what Priti Patel's sort of asylum reforms are really about, and this is really interesting because they specifically are looking at asylum, and when we say asylum, what we're saying is the optics of boats that are coming across the channel, because that is a big symbol, because we're an island nation, and there's this myth of this is it, these people, this othering, this, you can actually see it with these boats. That is why there is such a focus on asylum. But at the same time, yes, Nafisa is completely right. You know, my parents, the communities that we come from, feel a complete, much loyalty to Britain and have a different relationship with the British state. You know, my parents sort of voted for the current government and for Brexit. And for example, in Hong Kong, so what's happening there is, increasing influence from Beijing. Hong Kong's a former colony. It was handed back by the British to China in 1997, but there was an agreement that it would have its own system of democracy, which would be guaranteed for a certain number of years. Now, China is encroaching on that, and all sorts of concerning things are going on. A free press is sort of being obliterated, etc. But actually, Priti Patel herself has been very, very sort of open about, well, we need to help these people in Hong Kong. And I think that, I haven't looked into it, but it'd be interesting to see that immigration, the immigrants from Hong Kong with their British national passports, I think, that's sort of being facilitated. So it's just, what I want to emphasize is that these these legacies of empire, we can still see them today, and they're playing out. There's different relationships with different types of immigrants, which is going on.
But it's so interesting, your family story, and the way you just explained it from a Sikh background, given the hinterland of the Amritsar massacre, is there's a kind of love-hate relationship. Like, the British abused us, they owe us. And it's never quite simple, these relationships with empire. They're kind of a tortured sort of relationship.
But there's a notion of contribution, not just after our parents came here, but before. We were the generations of the colonies. Those colonies, as Nafis said, were producing all of the wealth and the development that Britain benefited from, but fought for Britain, fought against fascism, fought for it. And so this contribution is both after the colonial project and crucially before. That is what creates this loyalty, love-hate legacy.
Well, the shadows of empire is one of your big themes, and a great theme on Byline Times. And before we go on to talk about the shadow of coronavirus, let's just have a look at this amazing essay you did with George, our producer, about Priti Patel, how her particular experience, she was, well, it's questionable whether she had to flee Uganda from Idi Amin, but she certainly was part of the Asian diaspora from Africa, from Idi Amin's Uganda, when he was threatening to deport all the Ugandan Asians. And let's just watch a little bit of that section to understand a bit about the mentality of Priti Patel.
Why did this photo of Priti Patel cause such a stir? The image of the Home Secretary attending what was widely reported on social media to be an immigration raid caused outrage, with many questioning the tastefulness of making a photo op out of such an event. In fact, the photo was not taken at an immigration raid, but the arrest of a suspected people smuggler, and was intended as part of a publicity drive around the Home Secretary's new plan for immigration. And in many ways, it was classic Priti Patel, but it was also more than that. The symbolism of that photo opened up a discussion which is rarely had in today's culture war debates around British history and the empire, specifically the experience of Asian immigrants from former colonies and how this background shapes their views on identity, policies such as immigration, and the future path of the UK.
With the first Indian origin Home Secretary ever in the UK, Right Honourable Priti Patel.
How can Priti Patel, herself the daughter of immigrants, take the hardline approach towards immigration that she does? The answer is complicated, but ultimately it's understandable. To many, Patel's politics are clearly surprising and at times abhorrent.
On that basis alone, I would actually support the reintroduction of capital punishment.
Abhorrent to those who might expect immigrants to hold certain liberal views on immigration. But to discover the truth, we need to dig deeper. The story of Asian immigrants to the UK and their roots in the British Empire is a complex one, and it's an experience which has shaped them in a very particular way. Priti Patel's parents were part of a generation of Ugandan Asians who settled in Britain in the late 1960s and 1970s. Uganda was a protectorate of the British Empire between 1894 and 1962, and under the British, tens of thousands of Indians were brought to the country, some to build the railways, but also to act as a buffer between Europeans and Africans.
And if you want to see more of that amazing film that Hardeep and George made, head over to our YouTube channel, and even more, you can help us make more of these great films. They take a lot of time, by supporting us on Patreon, on YouTube, or as you'll see at the end of the program, buying our new weekly TV guide, which will support us. But that's an amazing film, and I recommend you should see more of it. Now to another subject, which does include a bit of British or English exceptionalism, and that's the coronavirus. I'm joined by Davies again on this subject because he's been our lead investigator on herd immunity. This is something which was first mentioned, I remember the moment, on the morning of the 12th of March 2020 in a blog by Robert Peston. And I looked it up, and herd immunity had never been mooted before in a pandemic without a vaccine. And there was no vaccine then. In fact, it had not been used for 40 or 50 years as a strategy for public health, except with a vaccine, like with mumps and measles and rubella. And that went away, didn't it, Davies? For a while they said there's no herd immunity. We've seen Dominic Cummings talk about how it was Johnson Hancock pushing for it, and he was backed off it, and the whole Dominic Cummings charabang of criticism of hopeless Hancock and the trolley. But you discovered something, and you've covered it. We had a leak, didn't we, from a Home Office briefing saying this was last April they were going for herd immunity, i.e. letting it run riot. And we thought it would have gone away. Then 2 weeks ago, you looked at the SAGE reports, didn't you? You looked at some of the modelling did, and you saw herd immunity was back.
It's astonishing, really. I don't even remember why I was sitting there reading these documents, what prompted me, because I had got to the point where I was kind of like, I'm not going to read any more SAGE documents. I'm done with this. It's just, and something prompted me to do. I can't remember what it was, and I was looking through, and I found this astonishingly candid reference to the idea of herd immunity in February, in a SAGE paper that was summarising all the modelling that they were doing for the roadmap, so the roadmap out of lockdown,
yeah. And
it literally said herd immunity is not going to be achieved without a large resurgence in transmission, rough paraphrase, which is astonishing, and I read that, and then I was like, okay, I need to see this modelling. Went and had a look at the stuff that they had published, and every single modelling exercise that had been done by all of the main kind of SAGE advisors, and you're talking about Imperial College, Warwick University, the London School of Tropical Hygiene and Disease, whatever it's called. I think there may have been one more, I can't remember. But all of them had done this modelling exercise. They had 3 or 4 scenarios that they were looking at, and every single one of those scenarios incorporated this same idea of how much immunity can we get from natural infection. And what was really interesting was all the graphs actually showed that they were anticipating a rise in infections going out to next year, almost as long as, in some of the models, the summer of next year. So completely contradicting what the kind of government narrative at the time was, that, brilliant, vaccines are going to be the main thing, and we're going to we've got control of the infections, and vaccines are going to sort it all out. So, we ran the story, and the story was that the Cabinet Office, in these documents, was revealed as having asked SAGE to model these scenarios, that we're going to look at these particular, all of them involved this incorporation of herd immunity by natural infection, which was quite, again.
And if I'm right, did it often mention young people?
Yes,
so that was the.
So the key thing was, we've vaccinated most of the vulnerable elderly population, but we have this kind of very large corpus of young people under a certain age who aren't vaccinated, and although they, some of them might be vaccinated up, around the age of 18 or something, but below that, doesn't look like it's going to happen. So we have to. So how are we going to deal with this? So they. It was interesting because the models didn't they referred to it in different ways. They wouldn't specifically use the term herd immunity or things like that, but they all talked about population immunity. They all talked about natural infection. They all incorporated a rise, and we were talking about millions of people. When you look on the graph,
it's like 2.5 million.
2.5 million was an absolute minimum increase of infections. You're really looking at, if you were going to follow through with the logic of the rise in numbers, you were looking at 2.5 to anywhere between 10 to 20 to 30 millions of infections.
And that's the number of people who haven't had a double jab, isn't it? It's like 30 million or 20 million haven't had any vaccination, and 30 only
one.
one.
So they had, and they also incorporated people who might only have one dose, and also an infection to kind of have this to contribute to the immunity. So it was really interesting that had been specifically modelled. And when the first model was done in February by Imperial College, they didn't have any mention of this. There was no mention of natural infection at all. So
that was added.
Days later, that was added in. And the Cabinet Office was referred to as being responsible for deciding which scenarios should be used. And that was what was astonishing to me, because a lot of people are obviously saying, well, it's just modelling.
Yeah,
and
they have to.
I think that was also the response of the Department of Health when they spoke to me and they said, look, Nafeez, we don't. What's in these documents could be anything really. We discuss everything, but they didn't discuss everything. They only discussed one thing, which was in every scenario, and that was what I found very astonishing. So we ran this story, we put it out, and
we were told not to run it.
We were told not to. We were told that this is inaccurate. We were encouraged not to run it, but we kind of pressed ahead. And we made sure that the piece was properly worded. We didn't want to panic people. We didn't want to inflame things. We wanted to give people information, and this is exactly what we told the Department of Health, that look, we need to have a public debate about these models.
And we gave them the right to comment, and you spoke to a couple of other epidemiologists, Deepti Kudasani, who's a mathematical modeler, and somebody from America who was quite appalled by putting this model in at all.
Yes, Yunir Bayam,
yes,
who's a very well-known pandemic expert who's advised the Centers for Disease Control in the United States and the White House, and he was really shocked and said this is absolutely astonishing. It's completely unethical to be contemplating this kind of mass infection, and of course, it's not just about hospitalizations and death. It's also there's long COVID. There's this huge percentage of people who are having these kind of very, very difficult symptoms, and it's with them for many, many months, and we don't understand this disease. We don't understand the impact on the brain.
And the other problem isn't it, with herd immunity, just in case people don't understand, and people have been saying this for a year, is variance, is vaccine escape. The more times it mutates, the virus, infecting people, and millions of viruses in billions in each person, and that's millions of people, the more chance you get an adaptive mutation, which is more virulent or more infectious or more deadly.
Yeah, it gets more. There's a risk, and it's already happened. We've seen this now with the Delta variant. Yeah. That there's a certain percent, 20 to 40% kind of less antibodies, and that we now know that the current vaccines are slightly less effective. And imagine if we continue running this, and most epidemiologists and experts and virologists are saying, if you let this thing run, it creates ideal conditions for new mutations to arise. And that's kind of like it's like Russian roulette. You don't know where it's going to go.
And that's what they've gone with, because what's really interesting about this is, see, we ran your story,
2 weeks ago,
and it sort of very shortly afterwards coincided with two things, which was the departure of Matt Hancock, the arrival of Sajid Javid as new Health and Social Care Secretary, who's very much like all of the restrictions should be lifted, and when they are, it's going to be irreversible. And then the official announcement from Boris Johnson saying on July the 19th, yes, England will essentially be left to its own devices. I mean, it's interesting because that you can thread that herd immunity through to the policy that's been announced.
It's interesting, since you published that, they have admitted it. I mean,
yes,
there's it's in the Mail today. We're going for, there's a new phrase, hybrid immunity. And their attitude to schools, which is very little, ventilation,
I think
masking,
ending bubbles and the need for people to isolate.
So we thought it was incompetence. This looks like purposeful activity. But you read another piece this week which explains why, to a certain extent, this? Do you think? Because explain to the revelations you had about the Great Barrington Declaration and how there have been, and you've written about this for the last year and a bit, a group of people who, I don't know, medics, ideologues, who very much believe in this libertarian idea of letting it rip, almost Darwinian idea of taking it on the cheap.
And seem to have avenues of access to the people in power making the decisions.
Well, we have, I mean, the story we broke last October, I believe it was, when we had this, the Great Barrington Declaration that suddenly popped up on the internet. And, it's claimed to be signed by thousands and then tens of thousands of medical experts.
Including yourself, I think you signed it.
Yeah. Well, I thought, let me test this out. Yes. And I tested it out and I invented a persona and I invented a kind of medical thing. Just to see what would happen. Was there a vetting process? And I manufactured a Harvard degree, medical degree and all the rest of it, and a silly name. And it wasn't picked up, it was just an automated process. And then my profile ended up being there, my signature was part of it. And then it became clear very quickly, and I just tweeted about it at the time, and it became very clear that all of these signatures that were appearing were mostly fabricated. There was no vetting process. So, there were tens of thousands of medics, but we had no idea of telling who they really were. But it was originally signed by, I think, 22 or maybe maximum 30 different medical people. There were scientists who signed it, but there were a very tiny number of them in reality. And then it turned out when we investigated this, it was sponsored by this American Institute for Economic Research, which is a very well-known libertarian right-wing think tank.
Based in Great Barrington.
Based in Great Barrington, which is why it was called the Great Barrington Declaration.
And what was it advocating?
So it was basically saying that, it was talking about this focused protection approach. It was saying that we should protect the vulnerable, but otherwise let the virus rip. And the criticisms of that came from, shortly after that, there was actually a cohort of British scientists that started a similar thing, and it was the John Snow Memorandum. It was published in the Lancet, and that got something like 6,000 to 7,000 real verified kind of medical experts behind it and public health experts. And they said, look, the problem with this idea is that there's just no feasible way of ensuring that you can protect the elderly in this way and kind of cushion them off and ensure that while the virus is letting rip, because of intergenerational connections and contact and having to look after them, and it just doesn't work. It's not going to work.
And I think you wrote about the economic impact of just going, because I would be one of that population, wouldn't I? Shielding the over 50s or the 60-year-olds. The economic, it would be just as it would be dire in itself.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there was actually an economic analysis that can be done as what happens if you do push all the elderly people. And what is actually been shown is that elderly people up to like 50 and over spend a huge amount of money into the economy, because obviously they're kind of in from the boomer generation, and they've made a lot of money, a lot of wealth. They spend on their children, they spend on their grandchildren, they spend on themselves, on holidays, you name it. And there was an analysis that was done that you take out a huge chunk, something like 10 to 20% of GDP, by shutting down that economic activity in that sector of the population. So either way, we were looking at the reality that we were going to face an economic crisis of some kind, but what we needed to do was find the best way of dealing with the fundamental cause, which was the pandemic itself. And if we can mitigate that and control that in the best possible way, we can get out of it. But this approach was saying, no, let's just let it rip. And
it was responsible, wasn't it? Because some of the signatories were in the room with Boris Johnson when he delayed that crucial circuit breaker at the end of September last year, which then led to another 100,000 deaths. Is that not right? It's something like most of the deaths, the fatalities from COVID happened after that period in the second wave.
So it's quite insidious, because this think tank, not only, we exposed that it had funding from the Koch brothers and all the rest of it.
The Koch brothers being a well-known right-wing libertarian industrial family who fund a lot of these causes.
Very well known for extreme free market ideology, and also other things as well. Anti-black kind of activism and all this kind of stuff.
Climate change denial.
Yeah, climate science denial was very millions, one of the biggest climate science denial funders, and this particular think tank had formed for lots of anti-science activity. So again, they were in cahoots with the tobacco industry, in cahoots with other kind of private healthcare companies, lots of anti-environment activism and all the rest of it. So this was something that was familiar to them. And this line of attack very much fit the ideology. So it was really disturbing to see that there were lines of communication between some of the scientists who had founded this thing and the UK government. I mean, obviously they had lines of communication with the Trump administration, which you'd not be so surprised. But then we had Sunetra Gupta, the Oxford professor, for instance, having a meeting with Boris Johnson last September, I think it was.
Yeah, September 21st.
Yes, with another academic, Carl Hennigan, who they've ended up forming together a couple of months later, a kind of successor organisation to the Great Barrington Declaration called Collateral Global, which has been set up by Gupta's partner, who he also revealed, Alex Cascio, who's a Ministry of Defence contractor.
He wrote the first draft.
Who actually wrote the draft. Well, he was there, and he's actually openly, finally, and we actually broke the story for everyone else, but he actually admitted a couple of months ago on the Collateral website that, you know, he was in love with Gupta and he wanted to support her, and he came up with this idea, and he was essentially, it was his brainchild. So all of them together working on kind of essentially creating this lobbying network.
Yeah.
And they were very successful. I mean, it was the Sunday Times, I think, that broke the story, that particular story, that this meeting played a particular role in changing Boris Johnson's mind and delaying.
Because and Cummings said he was urging for, most people are urging for lockdown. But they're back, aren't they, Nafees?
They're back. Because
this current new, the unlocking down now, this sort of July the 17th, is it the 19th or 17th? 19th. 19th, so. You detected their involvement in the government now.
Yes. So back in April, there was an open letter, and there's been, people will remember there were several of these open letters, all of them coming from the same nexus. You know, Sunetra Gupta had signed a letter many months before the Great Barrington Declaration, which caused a bit of a buzz, and everyone was talking about it, and the government was talking about it, and all the rest of it. So we had an open letter that went out, and Gupta was signing, and Carl Hennigan was signing, and many of these other people. In fact, we've discovered that 10 of the signatories were Great Barrington Declaration signatories. But this whole enterprise, we discovered was, and we reported this this week, that it was basically coordinated by a government advisor, Professor Robert Dingmore, who's a consulting sociologist, and has been advising the government on pandemic stuff, and specifically he's advised SAGE. He's sitting on NERVTAG, and even the JCVI, the Joint Vaccination and Immunity group. He's sitting on the COVID vaccine subcommittee in that group. So, and advising Chris Whitty as well, specifically. So quite an influential figure.
And there's scientific debate, there's scientific dissent, but the reaction to that line of thinking, this back to hybrid immunity focused protection, has shown this is quite a minority opinion the British government is taking it. I mean, I think the World Health Organization called it reckless and morally empty. The backlash against this decision has been huge, including a letter in the Lancet. Is that right?
Yes, and the Lancet. I mean, we had an initial group of 120 scientists who published a letter in the Lancet, including Sir David King, the former chief scientific advisor, essentially saying that this is a really reckless policy, and it's a self-inflicted wound, in effect, that we're doing to ourselves, and it's going to create problems for the NHS. It's going to be unsustainable. It won't work. And
as the other ones didn't work, it didn't work in September.
And
we had to have a bigger lockdown than any other country because we let it escape.
I guess the two questions that really need answering is, where was the genesis of this herd immunity? Beyond any one person, how was it filtered in particular, to the Westminster government's approach? And why do these sort of scientists that you've mentioned seem to have these avenues of access to the Prime Minister, to the Chancellor, people who are making these decisions, when, SAGE, the government has its own advisors, there are doctors' groups, there are lots of warnings coming from elsewhere, and yet there's preferential sort of access being given one way? I mean, what's your sense, Nafees, of where this has all come from the beginning?
Well, I think part of the problem is we've got this ideology that's been sitting there, which is this kind of an extreme market ideology, which is kind of intermingled with a kind of nationalism. And it's just, we've seen this with Brexit. We've seen that it entails certain types of ideas. And one of those ideas is you know, we don't really want to do massive investments in public health. We really want to privatize everything out and bring in all the big money to come in. It's a specific way of seeing things, whether it's right or wrong. It's a way of seeing the world, and that's why we've had the Koch brothers come in, or well, it's the Koch brother. I mean, you know, one of them passed away, but you know, had Koch Industries and the Koch Foundation, all the rest of it. But we've also had, interestingly enough, you know, the same Vote Leave kind of faction have rallied around this, and the same
And
kind of
free speech union.
all the rest of it. And, you know, we've had Vote Leave donors who to the Conservative Party who have actually rallied around and funded the Conservative Party's COVID recovery group, which have been working in alliance with various pandemic disinformation outfits. You know, there's so many of them. Right? There's Heart, there's Us for Them, the kind of the pseudo parents lobby group. There's several of them now.
So this is what interests me, which really rings bells with Brexit, is the presence of dark money and also kind of dark lobbying operations with social media enablement. So, you know, you go onto one of the threads, suddenly you're surrounded by COVID minimizers, let's call them, or, you know, lockdown skeptics, often very insincere accounts or inauthentic looking accounts. And it's what I understand what happened to Johnson, it is the rump of those ERG Tory MPs. Steve Baker is a key figure in this. Who targeted him? I.e., that the final people who kind of sat on him were that rebellious group. You know, they're activated that social media network. They have all the bots really lying around. They have all that access to money. It's like they can't help themselves. Is that a fair analysis, would you say?
I think it is, yeah. And I think that's what's interesting, is that you have these pre-existing networks that have already captured so many governments. We've seen this. It's the populist response, and these populist regimes, you know, whether it was the Trump administration or certain regimes in Europe, Bolsonaro, it's been, you know, in Brazil. We've seen it's a very similar response, that we don't want to respond to this with a huge reconfiguration of our societies that requires intelligently adapting and, you know, actually getting involved in public health proactively to save lives, and then of course livelihoods as well. In fact, it sees it as a zero-sum game. Yeah. If you save lives, livelihoods will have to go. If you save livelihoods, lives will have to go. Whereas it's not true. If you've seen, I mean, we've seen in the case of New Zealand, Singapore, South Korea, and so many other parts of the world where they've taken a completely different approach, and it hasn't necessarily involved draconian lockdowns, and it
local lockdowns, very heavily targeted.
But it's you know, hard early action, and you know, kind of and a kind of sense of cooperation in the society, that people feel a sense of responsibility, and they don't need to be coerced to basically, you know, when the government says, look, we need to come together, then people are like, okay, let's do this. You know, we'll wear our masks, we'll be responsible, and so there wasn't any need for kind of huge, massive draconian responses, and they did, but you know, but they had certain things that were very strict about. They had border controls,
track and trace,
you know, track and trace, very
quarantine.
Yeah, so that all those, when you do these things, you have to do them properly.
And then you get out of lockdown really quickly.
Yes,
and the economic impact is much less than the UK, or for another example, Sweden, isn't it, which was held up by all the herd immunity avatars as the classics, but compared to Finland, Norway or Denmark, it had a higher death rate and a bigger economic impact.
And that's the question, I think, that many of the kind of lockdown skeptic factions are don't want to go into. You know, why is it that countries like Britain have had the worst of all worlds? I mean, even Boris Johnson acknowledged it in one of those WhatsApp conversations with Cummings, that we've had the worst of all what possible. We've got the worst economic outcome and the worst death toll. Why is that? Because other places have had completely different outcomes, and that's what they don't want to look at. And it's because of this inconsistent approach, where from the beginning it seems there's been this herd immunity ideology that is couched really in this deeper kind of libertarian right-wing economic
zero government.
And that's what's driving this idea. And we've always kept coming back. And it seems to me that the disavowal of herd immunity was never real. And it was interesting because, I mean, and Politico actually referred to some of the WhatsApp conversations that they had received, which showed that Cummings himself was one of the people who had told politicians, that let's not use the word herd immunity anymore because it hasn't got traction really. This was a PR move to essentially say, look, let's not use this terminology right now.
We're still doing it.
But the idea hadn't changed.
Yeah. That's very frightening. And so we have a sort of a potentially worrying summer ahead, but also things we can do, isn't it? We can wear masks if we choose to mask, choose to keep on socially distancing if we can. Hardeep, what do you think then of, now you know the full story of herd immunity, what does it make you feel that we are, I feel like we're on our own?
I feel we're on our own. I feel what Nafees is saying is really important. You know, the ultimate genesis of it, beyond any one politician, Cummings, Johnson, Hancock, it's actually a way of looking at the world, and I think that's really the key. I also think, unfortunately, time has run away with us, Peter. It's been so fascinating,
oh my goodness,
actually sitting here with you, Nafees, because you've worked with us for a while, but we've never actually met in person.
Absolutely.
We've just been so absorbed in what you've been saying, so thank you so much for all your insights. It's really kind of enlightening.
So as we close, we will come back as quickly as possible, only in a couple of minutes for some Q&A, and we'll then have to scoot. So if you stay with us another 10 minutes, Nafees, we'll try to keep it a bit briefer, but it is an amazing story, and Byline Times was there first. Let's just close by announcing our new little program, our new little way of supporting Byline TV, and that's by going to Byline Times subscription sites, and you can get our free weekly TV guide, which has behind the scenes photographs, notes, producer notes, and lots of other goodies, and links to all our top videos and telling you what's coming up. It's only £3 a month, you get it every week. If you support it that way, that's going to greatly help us keep on making these programs. So do pop over to bylinetimes.com subscriptions page, and you can support us there. And meanwhile, we'll be back next week, and for those who are subscribers, we'll be back in about 5 minutes.
Thank you for joining us. See you now.